Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Tonight, we are continuing our conversation on math and what tools we can use in our math classrooms, how to increase the engagement, and I'm going to share with you some of the tech tools that I am using or planning on using this year as I push myself into areas where I might not be super comfortable, and I am trying out new things such as spiraling in my classroom. So tonight I'm going to share with you a few of the tools that I'm using in my classroom that is pushing me into new directions with math and using technology to solve some of those problems that I've been having in my math classroom. So we'll get started. My name is Patty. If you're new to this show, Teaching with Inquiry Live, thank you so much for joining me here. I am a 4-5 split grade teacher here in Ontario, Canada, and I'm also the teacher blogger behind madlylearning.com. And I come live every single week talking about how to fit all of those things that we need to do together to use more inquiry in our classrooms every day. So thanks again for joining me. And again, like I said at the beginning, we are going to be talking about tech tools and the tools that we can use in our classroom. We're going to push our math and solve some of our problems. So I'm going to cover in some of the ones that I've been using, as well as some of the ones I plan on using in the future, especially perhaps talking about this little guy here and how I'm going to be using him in my math classroom. So stay tuned for that. I'll be covering him at the end. So first things first, one of the things that I am going to show you here. So one of the things that I want to show you tonight is how I'm using Google Forms. So I'll start with the problem and why I started using Google Forms and how that is solving problems for me. So in my classroom, one of the things that I have to encounter all of the time is students that do things digital because a pencil and paper task, well, frankly, if they did it, I would A, have to scribe for them, or B, I would have pretty much no hope at figuring out what it was that they were trying to do. And their output of stuff that they would do, pencil and paper task, is so minimal compared to the thinking and thought that are going on in their head. So I have to find different ways to access that information in math classroom in a way that is also not going to put a lot of the burden on me to be constantly providing one-to-one support for those students. Because quite frankly, in a classroom with almost 30 students and one teacher, I simply just do not have the time to be able to meet the needs of my students on one-on-one without consuming my entire day and ignoring all of my other students. I wish I really could be there one-to-one for all of the students that need it, but instead there's things that I can do with technology, especially in math, that can help me to sort of bridge that gap and create more of an independent worker in those students so that they are more self-sufficient and do rely less on me, the teacher, to solve all of their needs. There's certainly still places where I will have to scribe, but not on every single question. So it means that I can tailor what I'm doing and the questions that I'm doing to make sure that I have all of those things in place for students. So one of the things I use is Google Forms. Now, just this year alone, I've started to not just use Google Forms to simply collect information, but I've also started to use Google Forms as a way to assess students. So I really want to be able to use these in a way that allows me to give a digital version of a pencil and paper test. So the last test I did, I actually had 6 different versions that were handed out to students. I had a grade 4 version, I had a grade 5 version of the place value test because I do teach a split. So there was those 2 grades. I had an IEP pencil and paper task for both grade 3 and grade 2. So there's 4 different grade levels of a pencil and paper task, as well as I had 2 digital versions of my modified grade 3 as well as my standard grade 4 test. So there's 6 versions of my test. Now, that sounds like a lot, but just to accommodate all of the needs in my classroom, that's what I'm having to create. So if you are probably in a similar situation where you've got multiple needs in the classroom, you're making multiple versions of the same test. Or maybe I'm just a crazy person that does that to myself. Maybe that's also why I don't do so many tests. That could be it. So I did have 6 versions of the test. This is an example of an activity I did. The one that's showing on the screen about fractions is an example I did last year of simply just a activity that students were doing. And then I also did this place value test here. This is the one I was talking about. This is place value test A. And all I did was convert all of my pencil and paper questions into a digital multiple choice form. Now I have multiple choice questions. I also have open response questions where they would have a word problem. It allows me to upload a photo in certain word problems. So what we ended up doing with those students is they would take the word problem, they would solve the word problem using manipulatives or on their piece of paper. And then they would take that information and take a photo of that and then upload that photo onto the test so that I could see their thinking. And then they enter in the correct answer in a box below, which would then mark their question. So I had the ability to go back into their test and see their work. And most often I was doing that with students, helping them through because it's their first time. But what it did do is because I had 4 or 5 students working on a digital version of that test, it freed up that time so that I could work with students one-on-one on certain questions, as well as meeting the needs of the other students that were doing the pencil and paper tasks. Using the digital version freed me up to be able to help more students, as opposed to spending my entire time helping some students or having those some students getting really frustrated because the pencil and paper task simply isn't collecting the knowledge that they have. So I had really good feedback from my students on the digital test. They really liked having that ability to do it. One of the things I did learn is it's a lot harder to print out and share with parents. So we don't have the ability in our board to share what happens in Google Classroom directly with parents through email. So I would have to print out their answers and somehow make that legible to parents. So that was a little bit of a problem that I'm still going to have to figure out. But I definitely got more accessible answers from those students that did the digital test than I ever would have received from them if I had simply had them doing a pencil and paper task. So for me, that was a really valuable experience, is to use that Google form in order to have them capture their thinking in a test form, because they could read the questions to them. They could use Google Read and Write to read the questions on the test for them, or they could also answer it digitally, as well as using paper or even video of them explaining their thinking. They could upload a video as well right into the Google form. So that was super handy. Google has their Excel version as Google Sheets. And as students are finishing different tasks, they actually have sheets that are assigned to them in Google Classroom that they can go in and fill out, that lets me know where they are progressing in, say, a timed addition test. So this is just the blank document that a student would fill out. And because I'm using Google Classroom, it actually makes a copy of this for each one of my students with their names on it, automatically saved into everyone's drive. And this sheet is filled out every time a student does a test, and it helps them to track their progress. If students are tracking their progress on this sheet, I'm also not necessarily needing to collect all of the information on where they're doing. I can just look at their sheet and just make sure that it's being completed and filled out. They're also keeping all of their tests in their notebook, but it's a secondary layer, and it's not me going through and tracking all of that for 30 students. They're tracking it themselves. So it saves me time on something that is a fairly routine, low-level practice type work. I don't need to be collecting that and marking that all of the time. But one of the things I can do is have my students take responsibility for tracking their own progress and putting it into this Google Sheet. In all honesty, it did take a little bit of time to get my students familiar with how to input this information. There was a bit of a learning curve for them, but once they got a hang of it, then it's going along smoother for, I would say, about 75% of them. And I'm only really chasing 25% to enter in their information, which is far better than chasing 100% and marking all of their time tests, which is really just time consuming. So that's how I'm using the Google Forms as well as using Google Sheets in my classroom specifically to help me with math. And that's just an example of what that's going to look like in our Google Classroom. And they don't actually hand this in to me. They just click the attachment there and it opens up their own version of that. They enter in their progress and they leave it. And because they don't have to turn it in, they always have editing access, and I always have access to it as well. So it's shared with me. So the other thing that I'm starting to use in my classroom, which my students really love, and it solves this problem. So I want students to be able to do something in a center that they can do independently, and it's sort of fun and engaging, not a lot of marking for me, but it keeps them busy so that I have time to work with small groups. I think we all get what I'm saying here, right? We need just something that is high level thinking and engaging, but it's also going to have them practice, but killing some time so that we can do stuff with our small groups. Because really that's where a lot of learning is happening, especially if you're using spiraling and guided math. You need them to be doing something that they don't need you to do. So I know for a lot of teachers, there's games that they're playing there, or they're putting them on those web apps that you can just kind of play through games. My concern, my big problem with that was I was finding some of the games, they weren't actually doing the math, and they were spending most of the time chasing each other around the worlds in these games, or they would bounce between games and they would end up playing some games that were lower than I wanted them to be playing. So they're playing really simple games for where their math level was, or they were playing games that were completely unrelated to our learning goal. And it was really hard for me to track what they were actually doing in their progress. So I found that really discouraging. And if they weren't going to spend time actually getting better at math, although I wanted an activity for them to just do so that I could work with a small group, I do still want there to be some type of accountability and make sure that it's not just playtime, because I want them to actually be learning and have fun, but I don't want it to be simply playtime. I want there to be some way to track that. So in came last April, I was at a conference and I ran into a few teachers. I did a presentation and they came up to me talking about my presentation, and I was asking them kind of, what they do. And they were talking to me about what's called boom cards. Now, this is something that I had not really heard of, didn't really understand what it was. And I was kind of asking them like, okay, well, how do you use boom cards? So one of the teachers pulls up their phone and pulls up boom cards on their phone. Now, this is boom cards. This is the homepage for boom cards. And I wondered, well, what is this boom cards things they're talking about? Essentially, boom cards is a set of flashcards. It's a set of flashcards that a teacher designs. And it's very similar if you're trying to use digital tools. So you can use something like Google Slides, or interactive activities that teachers are designing and planning for students to use. And a lot of the times they're using things like Google Slides. So I tried to make myself a Google Slide for my students when it came last year for geometry, where they had to slide and move things around and sort objects. It was a nightmare. It looked really pretty when I did it, but in actuality, the students, when they were moving things around and trying to manipulate objects and photos on Google Slides in a digital worksheet, what was happening is they were resizing the triangles, they were moving them around, sometimes they would get deleted, things wouldn't necessarily go. There's a whole lot of problems with it. I loved the concept, but it didn't really work for me. I also didn't want to just put them on a game, because I knew full well they would just simply wander around the world chasing their friends and not actually do some of the math unless they're on them watching them. She explained boom cards to me. This sounded really intriguing. And I finally had time to actually implement these in my classroom a couple of times, and my students are really enjoying them. And I plan on continuing to use them in my classroom. So what are they? They're like flashcards, and they're manipulative in a way. So you sign up for boom cards here. And I've already signed up. So you will sign up for boom cards, and essentially what you get is you buy decks. or you make your own decks. And essentially a deck is a bunch of flashcards that you're making. And you can make those on, say, PowerPoint or Keynote and just save them all as image files, and you can upload them here onto Boom Cards if you want. Or you can get some of the free ones that are up here. You can also purchase some from Teachers Pay Teachers, or you can purchase them straight here through Boom Cards. So I've actually purchased a few myself, but this is what my teacher dashboard looks like. Now there's a bunch of different options for playing. You can do a fast play where you're not tracking student data, and that's free. I have paid for membership. I think it's at $25 a year, and that allows me to have a class list. So instead of just not tracking student play, I can actually have my students sign in under a username that I've made for them, and I can track their individual play. And what it does is it allows me to use, say, my Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I don't have any of my own for math. I've only purchased other cards for math. This is one I made for my Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I gave it to my students to just test it out. And I can track my students' progress through these cards. They're right, they're wrong, how many times they attempted a card, what they got right, how long it took them to finish it. All of that data is collected automatically. So I can go in and actually track their progress, and I'm the one who made the card. So I know that the cards that are there are the ones that I want my students to be practicing because I've made them or I've gone through them myself. So they're very targeted, unlike maybe some games where there might be some questions you're not really in control of the content of that game. This you are. You know, these are interactive cards that you can use, and students, they just flash up a picture. And in the picture, there might be an answer box, and it might say 362 plus 87. And the students will think about that answer. They'll type it in the box. If the answer is correct, they will then move on to the next card, which will be another question. If the answer is incorrect, it'll give them a little auditory mong, and they'll try again. And it will not proceed to the next card until the student gets that card right. And it allows you as the teacher to really have a lot more ownership on what your students are practicing digitally in, say, a center. My students really like it. However, I will be honest, for my Canadian friends, a lot of the content math and Boom Cards is American. So you do have to be careful, especially the use of the comma as a place value separator, as well as money is not going to be in Canadian. If you happen to teach French immersion, there is a lot actually of French immersion cards that are on there that you can use for a relatively low cost. I don't personally have any on there, but I know that there's a lot of great, very familiar sellers that are on there that you'll recognize from TPT that would help get you started, or you can simply just make them yourself. Because like I said, you're just making a PowerPoint. You put the question on the PowerPoint slide, you save them as an image, you upload those images right into Boom Cards, and there's really easy tutorials right there on Boom Learning that tells you how to do that. You upload those cards. You maybe have 10 cards for students to do. Upload them, put the answer onto each card, and you're done. And that doesn't take a lot of time, and you can use them, and you can sell them too for other teachers to use. So that's 4. So we've done Google Forms and Google Sheets and Boom Cards. Oh, that's only 3. So here's my 4th one. This is an Innobot, and it's a robot, and it's really kind of cool. But this robot was given to me, and I will put the link to the company that gave it to me, and they wanted me to try it out. I have not yet used it in my classroom. I've used it a lot with my kids. They got so excited when I pulled it out again tonight to get it set up for tonight's live show. They love playing with the robot. It's so much fun. This is operated by code. So you use a program that comes with this, Scratch. It's based on the Scratch coding language, which I'm not a coder. I really know nothing about coding, but I'm willing to learn. That's where I'm pushing myself this year, as I'm learning. I'm going to learn how to operate this little robot. It's taken me maybe 2 YouTube tutorials to figure some of it out. I'm definitely not an advanced bot mover, but this little robot is pretty simple to use. For math, some of the things that's really cool about it is it has a little pencil holder. So you can put a pencil in there and it will hold, the pencil comes through the bottom and the pencil will go down. And what you can use with it is you can program the robot to travel along a path and make a shape. You can tell it to move forward. So this is the code that I'm going to show you. Pop that up on the screen here. There we go. This is the code that will tell this robot essentially to make a square. And what you start out with is simply just move the robot forward slowly, how many centimeters you want to move. Then you tell it the angle in which you want it to make a turn, so a 90-degree angle for a square. And then you can move ahead and do another 40 centimeters, 90-degree angle, 40 centimeters, and you end up with a square when you're done. Now, this is great if you're looking at math strands such as location and movement, or even geometry and angles. So if you're looking at making a triangle, you could have them program the different angles into the programming language, put the pencil in there, throw it down on a piece of chart paper, and it should make you a triangle, and the students can program the different kinds of triangles it can make by changing the angle that it turns. There's also different programming codes that are already built into it. You can just select a pre-programmed one, and students can just add a few steps at a time and figure out how to move the robot forward. But it's definitely something that will be interesting, that we'll have as a center perhaps in my classroom, or as a whole group as we learn how to do it together initially, because we're just going to model, share, guide, and independent before I throw a robot in front of them, I think. But we're going to learn how to do a little bit of coding and how that coding relates to math. So I've hooked up my video here, I think. I'm hoping it's going to work to show you the robot in action. And it'll run through that sequence there for you. This is my little chart paper, and I've just programmed the robot to go around. And it's definitely something that is interesting for students to look at, is using the Innobot. And there's lots of other robots too. This one is great for junior level students because it does get them a little bit of problem solving, and it has them using Scratch, which is a fairly easy programming using language designed specifically for kids. So using the Innobot, you actually have to program it. You can't just tap buttons on the top of it. You do have to figure out how to program this one to use with your students. So I'm excited. That will be our next math project in my classroom. So I know we've talked about, last week we talked about how we did a soccer tournament. Now we're doing a meal for parents. Our next one, robot. Those are the four things. Those are four things I have for you tonight on how I'm using tech tools in my class to enhance my math instruction and support spiraling in my classroom through things like math projects and differentiated instruction and inquiry-based learning. So I hope that's given you some ideas tonight on how to use some tech tools in your math classroom. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below and I will get to them. And you can see the blog post that goes along with this, where I will have that video posted of that robot moving there for you. And you'll find that at www.madlylearning.com. And if you want any of the information from this show as well as previous episodes, you can find that at www.teachingwithinquiry.com. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.